Scotland has somewhat of a reputation for being a little bit on the violent side. If the country was to have a preferred deadly sin, it would be wrath, followed very closely by gluttony. But anyway, today's man of the hour was no different. He was, to put it lightly, a big ball of hatred whose passion for perverse proclivities petrified many. A legacy of malice and wrath that somehow managed to last around 50 years before he was caught. As we will see, he was a man of many names, puzzling in more ways than one, with far too many names to his face. Scotland's very own Ted McBundy. Peter Tobin. Please leave a like and a comment on this video because it really helps me in the algorithm. Summer is just about here, and as we all prepare for that beach body and as the trees ripen and bloom, why don't you also try to turn a new leaf with today's sponsor, Fume. Use our actual Is this a f***ing poem? Hark ye, my defeated knaves, for Fume is a flavoured air device that has been making waves. Concerned about that one vice and bad habit? Then let me tell you of Fume and why you should grab it. Fear you not, as it uses no vapour for fuel, instead harnesses air in this nifty cute tool. With a metal base and wooden chassis, Fume is a stick that makes sucking classy. With flavours like maple pepper and white cranberry, rest assured that your sucking will be dapper and merry. I myself am a soft, gentle ginger fella, so my favourite flavour is yummy orange vanilla. 150,000 and not one few currently enjoys Fume, and you could too. So grab that old vice and crush it in a hydraulic press, for Fume has arrived with far more grace and finesse. Go to tryfume.com/Dankula today or click the link in the description. So sucking on hardwood can also become your life mission. That's tryfume, F-U-M, and code Dankula, or scan the QR code and your journey with Fume is bound to go far. I refuse to believe that they approved this. We don't know too much about our protagonist's early life, but I'll cover what we do know. Peter Tobin was born in Scotland, specifically in the town of Johnston, Renfrewshire, on the 27th of August, 1946. And for those not versed in the area, that's a small town just outside of Glasgow. He was the youngest child of 4 brothers and 3 sisters, which is quite normal for the time period because women were just built different back then. His father Daniel was an engineer by trade. And due to the nature of Glasgow itself and the surrounding area, it's pretty safe to assume that Tobin didn't quite grow up, rather he was dragged up, because the city had, and sort of still has, a reputation for frankly being a rough and tumble slum. Regardless, he seemingly got to escape it for a time, as in 1953, he was sent to a reform school at the age of 7. Tobin was described as a bit of a loner. Yet, despite this apparent social maladjustment, he was also purported to be something of a charmer. This strain of seemingly contradictory behaviour manifesting in a man is what we in the industry very often call a Sigma male. And, like all Sigmas, he hated women. Now, I hate women as much as the next guy, but this guy, oh, he really kicked it up a notch. Before the age of 20, Tobin claimed to have served for a spell in the French Foreign Legion, though that's probably a lot of shite. What I can say that he did for certain was he spent some time in Borstals. And for those of you that don't know what Borstals are, they are prisons for young offenders. He also served a short stint in Polmont Young Offenders Institution for petty crime. And after this, Tobin apparently worked for a short time in a boarding house as a chef. Now, to rattle on about his exploits. That word has a double meaning, as you will unfortunately soon see. So let's do a little bit of a timeline of Peter Tobin's fucked up shenanigans. A Tobline, if you will. In August of 1969, at 23 years old, birthday boy Peter Tobin decided that cooking is for dorks and women. So he decided to jaunt down to Brighton to live there for a spell. And it was there that he met and married his first wife, Margaret Mountney, who was 17 at the time. But it wasn't exactly what I would call a happy marriage, as, for one example, they decided to get a 10-week-old puppy who they named Butte. Now, Butte wasn't trained, and in fact was quite yappy, as puppies tend to be. Tobin didn't like Butte, so one night when Margaret came home and noticed the apparent absence of her beloved dog, she became a little bit concerned. Upon asking Pete what the dog doing, he complained that it was screaming and pissing on the carpet. So he threw the puppy out of the window. This somewhat alarmed Margaret, so she looked out of the window to see if the puppy was okay. And now I'm just relaying what she said. She claimed that she saw some young lads playing football with the puppy's head. Tobin then went on to force himself upon her 4 times and then stab her and leave her for dead. She survived because a downstairs neighbour rescued her after noticing blood dripping down through his ceiling. She very quickly divorced him, obviously, and before you ask, no, there doesn't seem to be any proof that he was arrested or prosecuted for this, because, as you will come to find, Tobin is very, very good at pulling a Houdini and just completely disappearing. 1970 apparently sees Tobin convicted and jailed for burglary and forgery in England. Now keep this in mind because it's actually a tale as to what comes next. 1973 sees 27-year-old Peter Tobin marry again, while he is still living in Brighton. This time to someone of a more appropriate age. The lucky gal is one Sylvia Jeffries, and the totally happy couple had 2 children together, Ian and Claire. Claire sadly died shortly after birth, which seemingly influenced Sylvia to leave Tobin after 3 years, taking their son Ian with her. Shortly after this, Ian also died. There are no details whatsoever on what specifically happened to either of the children, and to be honest, I would rather not dwell on it. There is enough child tragedies to go through in this video already. In literally 1984, 38-year-old Peter Tobin moved to Portsmouth, and while he was there, he allegedly repeatedly forced himself upon an 8-year-old girl over a period of 2 months. I say allegedly, he probably fucking done it, but anyway, the girl ended up telling her parents, who then called the police, and Tobin was arrested and brought in for questioning. Unfortunately, the police concluded that there wasn't enough evidence against Sleazy Pete, so they decided to just release him. 1989 has Tobin at 43 years old and finally employed again, this time as a travelling lagger, a thermal pipe worker. He wandered once again back to Brighton, and he did what he does best. Married a child. The unfortunate girl this time was 16-year-old Kathy Wilson, who Tobin met in a Methodist church. She also gave him a son by the name of Daniel. 1990 has the Tobin tribe moving back up to Scotland, this time to Bathgate. Remember this fact for later. 1991, the Tobin tribe decides once again to move, this time to Margate, Kent, on the other side of the country, not even a year after moving up to Scotland. Coincidentally, around this time, a 15-year-old girl named Vicky Hamilton is declared missing, and she was last seen near Reading in Falkirk, which isn't really that far from Bathgate. Probably nothing to worry about. Tobin got this house in Margate through a council house mutual exchange scheme. Basically, it was a programme so people in council houses who wanted to move somewhere else could mutually swap their houses with another family who wanted the same thing. But shortly after moving in, a neighbour spotted Tobin digging a hole in his back garden. But don't worry, this was for a sandpit for his son, of course, who around this time was apparently living away from Tobin, presumably with his mother, who probably wasn't too fond of Tobin anymore. In totally unrelated news, Dina McNichol, an 18-year-old girl from Essex, goes missing on the 3rd of August after getting a lift home from a music festival. Here's a completely unrelated fun fact: Falkirk is only a 20-minute drive from Bathgate, and Essex is only an hour's drive away from Margate. What a cool factoid that is in no way ominous at all. 1993 has Tobin moving once again, this time to Havant in Hampshire, apparently to be closer to his son for visitation. And while his young son was over at his flat visiting him, Tobin popped out for a little while. He went to nearby Lee Park where he met two 13-year-old girls, and he told them that he needed babysitters for his young son. And he brought them back to his flat, where he then drugged them and forced himself upon them. He used his young son as bait to lure these girls. Though, of course, when young Daniel walked in on his dad doing that, Tobin, in a presumed fit of impotent rage, decided to call the boy's mother and tell her to come and pick him up, under the pretense of him having a heart attack. Tobin then tied up the two girls and left them in the flat with the gas cooker on, obviously in the hopes of that killing them. But one of the girls managed to escape and bravely raised the alarm, and boy did she, because on September the 9th, BBC Crime Watch broadcasted an appeal for information in regards to Sleazy Pete, and after 40 days in hiding, he was finally dragged out and arrested. Turns out that he was hiding in nearby Coventry in the Jesus Fellowship Church under the name of Peter Wilson. How was he found? Well, the idiot was found by his car that was still being used by him, registered under his name with the same number plates and everything. So, unsurprisingly, Tobin was dragged to Winchester and he was sentenced to 14 years in prison. But he only served 9 years of his sentence. Why? Because fuck you, that's why. But anyway, the silver lining was that he was now a registered sex offender. Something that did help contribute to his downfall. 2004 brings 58-year-old Tobin out of prison and up to Scotland again. This time to Paisley, a hop and a skip down the road from his hometown of Johnson. Prophetic for what comes next. 2005 comes and goes, with Peter Tobin getting ran out of his flat after attacking a 24-year-old woman named Cheryl McLachlan. She managed to escape, but she suffered several stab wounds. She went to the police and they, for whatever reason, sat on their thumbs for a day and didn't pay a visit to his flat until the next morning. And by then, Tobin had, of course, fucked off into hiding again. This culminates in an arrest warrant being issued for him. 2006 is where all of his shenanigans up to this point come to a head, because Tobin once more retreated into a religious organisation under the name of Pat McLaughlin, working as a helping hand in St Patrick's Catholic Church in Anderston in Glasgow, embedding himself with the Samaritan's Food Bank and homeless charity Loaves and Fishes, as a handyman doing odd jobs, doing things like setting up tables and tending to the church during the waning hours of the day. It was here, hiding in plain sight, that Peter Tobin came across a 23-year-old Polish woman by the name of Angelika Kluk, who was working in the church as a cleaner to save up for her Scandinavian Studies course in the University of Gdansk. But sadly for Miss Kluk, she caught the ire and attention of Sleazy Pete, and on the 24th of September 2006, in the closing hours of the day when it was just him and Angelika alone in the church, he pounced. He hit Angelika over the head with a table leg and gagged her. He then went on to do you-know-what before murdering her. He then wrapped her up in bin bags, dragged her body through the church to a trap door, and dumped her under the floorboards in the church crawl space. It's also been theorised that Angelika could actually have still been alive for hours in the crawl space before succumbing to her wounds. So Tobin had committed a literal cardinal sin and dumped the body in God's house. Something I imagine he would not take kindly to. In the following days, Angelika Kluk was formally declared missing, having been last seen with creepy handyman Pat McLaughlin. So Tobin was brought in for questioning, to which he obviously gave a false statement. Then he disappeared faster than a black father. The police then decided to go public with the case through a BBC broadcast, with the names of the missing people, of whom McLaughlin was one of them. Then the strangest thing happened. A bunch of calls came in claiming that the attached photo was not Pat McLaughlin, but instead a missing sex offender by the name of Peter Tobin. This was seen as somewhat of a shock to the police, who rapidly scrambled to try and find Tobin before he went and pulled another Clark Kent and completely changed his identity. Because, you see, it's one thing if a witness goes missing after giving a faulty or suspect statement, but it's another thing entirely when said witness turned out to be a registered sex offender with a catalogue of aliases and the police just completely fucking missed it. That is a catastrophe in the making. So, as a result, there was a much higher amount of resources pulled into finding Tobin than would otherwise be the case. The only issue was, where the fuck was he? There was a faint lead with CCTV stills taken on the 26th of September outside St Andrew's Square bus station in Edinburgh. The stills seemed to show Tobin getting on a bus. The trail did go cold for a couple of days, but eventually they got him. On September the 28th, a day before the body was found, mind you, that's right, this was still just a missing persons case, they hadn't even found Angelika's body yet, one Dr. Nick Losif, working in the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery in London, noticed that one of his patients, a James Kelly, who was admitted for mysterious nondescript chest pains, bore a very striking resemblance to the man of interest on the telly. Dr. Losif informed the police of his suspicions, so they decided to send down an officer named PC Alan Murray. But in order not to spook Tobin and have him pulling his vanishing act again, they dressed the officer up as a nurse and had him go into the ward. As soon as the officer saw him, he knew for a fact that this was the man they were looking for. Peter Tobin. And just like that, Sleazy Pete was caught. On March 23rd, 2007, he was dragged to Edinburgh's High Court to face trial on 1 count of murder and 2 counts of attempting to pervert the course of justice. It only took 4 hours because, let's be real, the guy was fucking guilty as sin. He got a minimum of 21 years in prison. However, as we all know, Angelika Kluk was not a one-off. The police started looking into Peter Tobin's history, and the man had lived in many places all over the country. But it turns out that in all of the places Tobin had lived during the times that he was living there, girls had gone missing. Remember Margate? Remember the sandpit? Well, strap yourselves in, this story's about to get 100 times worse. The police went to the sandpit and they started digging. So, just a few months after being found guilty of murdering Angelika Kluk, Tobin was also now charged with the murder of Vicky Hamilton. Then, not even a week later, they also found Dina McNichol's body just a few feet away from the sandpit. Tobin was convicted for Hamilton's murder with a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years, but he never really got a conviction for McNichol. Technically, due to the fact that he wasn't really fit to stand trial, but he's already serving multiple life sentences, so we've already got the guy. But this was a lot more about getting closure for the families and proper burials for the victims. I didn't really know where to fit this part in, but when Tobin was being transferred to prison, he tried to kick a reporter. I guess he's not all that bad. That was a joke, I'm sorry. It was at this time, after McNichol's body was discovered, that the police had a bit of a revelation. Tobin likes killing and forcing himself upon women. But he also likes moving around under different aliases. The police knew that there was definitely more victims, and so began a full investigation known as Operation Anagram, whose job it was to try and build a timeline of Tobin's whereabouts and see if it intersected with any unsolved missing persons or murder cases. This was a string they pulled on that revealed far, far more than they could ever have possibly expected. Almost all of the information that I presented today pre-1994 was only found through this investigation. Part of the reason why none of this was linked to Tobin until Operation Anagram was not only the fact that he changed names constantly, but also that he would constantly move outside of police jurisdictions. No one constabulary could get a full picture of him until they all got together and pulled everything they all had on him into a single comprehensive profile. And even then it was all still a bit murky, not helped by the fact that all of the surviving bureaucracy that could be linked to Tobin was under a bunch of random names, since he had up to 40 separate aliases, where he would sometimes take or modify a surname of one of his victims as a presumed trophy. Speaking of trophies, Tobin also had a suspicious amount of women's jewellery and other such baubles in his possession, which was of great interest, to say the least, as far as Operation Anagram was concerned. Operation Anagram revealed that Peter Tobin may have had ties to dozens of separate missing persons and murder cases, helped by the fact that he had a type: young women. There are numerous examples, including the likes of Jessie Earle, a 22-year-old woman from Eastbourne who disappeared in 1980 under suspicious circumstances. Her body was found naked on a cliffside in 1988, 8 years later. Tobin was also in Eastbourne at this time, working in a hotel. Jessie Earle's friends told officers that shortly before her disappearance, she told them about being nervous about a middle-aged Scottish man that she met on the beach nearby to where her body was found. Now, if you've been paying attention, whenever Tobin does a fucky-wucky, he tends to up sticks and leave, usually checking into a hospital or religious sanctuary. Well, right after this murder is when, if you remember, Tobin, alongside his third wife and son, just suddenly moved up to Bathgate in Scotland. Also, he had been checked into a hospital in Glasgow shortly after moving up. So, despite the lack of hard genetic evidence, there is a strong case for Tobin being Jessie's murderer. Another one, Louise Kay, an 18-year-old also from Eastbourne who in 1988 had disappeared along with her car under suspicious circumstances. She apparently met a Scottish man who gave her money for petrol. This, paired with the knowledge that Tobin was still working in that same hotel nearby and that shortly after she disappeared, Tobin was apparently trying to sell a hand-painted car. This was obviously her car that he painted himself to try and disguise it. Despite having Tobin's house there searched and not coming up with a body, the fact that two women of the same profile from the same area disappeared in the same time frame and both of them reported meeting a Scottish guy, it's pretty obvious it was Tobin. I could list off the entirety of the report, but I would rather not have this video be any more bloated and depressing than it already is. Though I will do one more for the sake of fan service. Remember the unsolved case of the Scottish serial killer Bible John? Well, if you're a long-time viewer of this channel, you'll probably remember that I did a video on him. And yes, Peter Tobin was indeed a suspect, though an incredibly unlikely one, because simply put, he was in Brighton with Margaret Mountney, his first wife, while the Glasgow Bible John murders took place. This, paired with his dental records and the observation that Tobin isn't a ginger, plus his DNA not being a match to any of the DNA that was found at the Bible John murder scenes, means that we can quite safely discount him being Bible John. Though Bible John did have an incredibly similar target profile, and he did his killings in the same area that Tobin grew up in. But despite all of the overlaps between them, the police did kind of prove that Peter Tobin was not Bible John. Tobin's concrete kill count on paper is only 3, but it's estimated to be substantially higher, with one psychiatrist who interviewed Pete in prison claiming that he confessed to killing around 48 people. How many of those are genuine and not just him bragging because he's a filthy fucking animal, we don't know. But there are enough weird links over a long enough period of time where that 48 number could actually be somewhat plausible. The police do think that he could be responsible for dozens of murders, and they think they even know which specific ones. But with a complete lack of evidence, the only way to know for sure is to get Tobin to just confess and tell them where the bodies are. But unfortunately, Tobin never did. That kill streak didn't get him anywhere, however, because as he was already in his 60s by the time he got put in prison for life, his numbered days only grew shorter, because he was old, frail, in failing health, and most importantly, a pedo in a Scottish prison. He was targeted, as he found out on July the 1st, 2015, when he was visited in his sleep by fellow inmate and adult rapist Sean Moynihan, who proceeded to slash Peter Tobin across the face with a razor. This didn't kill punished Pete, but it did leave him disfigured. During questioning, Moynihan claimed that he decided to attack Peter Tobin because, and I quote, "Tobin has been annoying me for months with his attitude towards his offences, and his refusal to tell anyone where the rest of the victims' bodies are." That is to say, he didn't like the crusty pedo's bragging and brandishing of his kill streaks. Moynihan got an extra 32 months added to his sentence for the attack. Tobin never truly recovered from his wounds. Womp womp. I mean, he was a 69-year-old man who was already in failing health with a suspected heart attack back in 2012. He was hospitalised again in February of 2016, with the reason this time being a suspected stroke. By 2019, he was said to be suffering from cancer, and after a few more hospital visits throughout the year, he passed away on October the 8th, 2022. Absolutely rest in fucking piss. His ashes were scattered at sea because no one came to claim his remains. And thus, we have the tale of Peter Tobin. The ballad of an absolute fucking animal who took human form and brutalised an unknowable amount of innocent people, all to sate his degenerate urges. Throughout this video, I've been rather tone deaf, making aloof and idiotic jokes throughout this story. Why? Well, frankly, Peter Tobin doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. He actually found it funny refusing to tell the police how many victims he had or where the bodies are. Refusing to give any of the grieving families closure. He found that funny. He actually found that funny. He was a complete fucking loser in life and still is in death. His victims, God rest their souls, are at peace, and most importantly, Tobin isn't. I know for a fact that absolute animal fucker is burning in the pits.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube!